Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Welcome to another episode of the Ham and Jam podcast. I'm your co-host and number one pilot in this Corsa that is Ham and Jam. Of course, I can't do this without my number two alongside me. Andy?
Well, hello, Kev, and thank you for calling me a number two. I don't quite know what to make of that, mate.
I think it's only fair since I've had to put up with your shenanigans.
Since you've had to put up with my number two on most episodes, yeah.
Yeah. So this author's book, The Day the Devils Dropped In, was one of the first ones that I added to my library. And Neil Barber, I can't say enough for you taking the time to come on our podcast and to talk about the 9th Parachute Battalion and what they did in Normandy. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and joining us.
Well, thanks for asking me again.
Well, when you're one of the preeminent authors of the 6th Airborne Division, there is no doubt that you will be back on Ham and Jam. As is always our tradition whenever we're in our pub and getting a drink, we always have to have something. Neil, what are you drinking?
I'm back on the mild.
Excellent. Andy, what are you having? As if the world didn't know.
I resemble that remark, Mr. Getz. Anyone would think that I have a one-track mind when it comes to my drinking habits. And they'd be absolutely right, because yet again, I am drinking a Guinness.
I did see on my CNBC scroller that their stock did go up. You must have made a purchase a few days ago, so I'm sure they appreciate that. I'm going to go with California red wine. So, gentlemen, as is our tradition, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Neil, you've written two of the most preeminent books on the 6th Airborne Division, obviously the assault on the Orne River and the Caen Canal. And you also wrote about the 9th Parachute Battalion and the Merville Battery. First of all, how on earth did this even come into your head to go, I need to do something to tell this story? How'd you get started with it?
It was, in effect, a sheer accident and quite a convoluted one, really. To try and cut a long story short, one of the big influences on me as a kid, regards history, was my uncle, Jeff Hayward. He was in the 1st 7th Middlesex, which was a machine gun battalion, and he went right through the whole war. He was at Dunkirk, El Alamein, Sicily, Normandy, and in Germany, in the Rhineland. And he, when I was a kid, at family parties, he would always tell these funny stories. It's only because when you get older, you realise they're not really very funny at all. It's just the way he told them. Mm-hmm. One of those that he said when he was serious, he said he always mentioned a place called the Chateau Saint Côme, and I'd never heard of it. And then in 94, I took him back out to Normandy and we visited the chateau, and he told me a bit more. And I thought, right, I'm going to, just as I did then, I just did my own research and my own education. Well, I still do. And I thought, right, I'm going to find out some more. I did a little bit that year, but the following year, his carrier driver came out, Dennis Daly. And Dennis was actually inside the chateau when it was being shelled by the Arethusa, and the Germans were in the barn next door. So I thought, right, I really want to know more about this, because the fighting was so appalling and the casualties so terrible. So dug a little way, found out really Middlesex were only there one night in effect, because they were attached to the Highland Div. And really, it was a 9th Parachute Battalion battle. So I spoke to one or two in Ronville Cemetery, although Dennis literally had to drag me to them because I just too in awe of them. I thought, why would they want to talk to me? But from there, I got in touch with the Reunion Club, and they were very helpful, and they gave me addresses, and I started going around the country interviewing the veterans, all the while thinking people are going to say to me, who are you? But that never really happened. It never really happened at all. So I ended up obviously becoming more and more knowledgeable about it. And of course, because there were so few men at the chateau, initially being scattered, as we'll talk about later, I had to go back to Merville, because I thought I'll avoid Merville because so much has been written about it. And it's only really when you, again, start digging into it and what has been written, you think, well, I've been told a lot more than he's written. So that's when I really started. I knew I had to go back to Merville and I had to cover it, and the drop and all this sort of thing. So that's really a bit convoluted, but that's how it came about.
Knowing that, if you hadn't embarked upon that journey, I almost wonder if it's a story that probably doesn't get told or just kind of is mentioned in passing.
I think it's funny. I was chatting to, I think, Andy and certainly some others about this year. It's weird because I'm kind of an underground writer in effect. I don't belong to any famous publisher, that kind of thing, or massive publisher. So I've got no publicity behind me. It is what it is. And then usually on a big anniversary, a publisher will say to someone, "Oh, write a book about the Airborne and mention Merville," and the same regurgitated stuff and myths will come out that you thought you'd cleared up. So I did for a time wonder if I actually had any impact at all.
I would certainly say that you have, Neil, because all you have to do is look at Arnhem and look at how many books, how many times can you tell that story, not seeing another book come out after yours that really follows that same path. So obviously you have done something to where you have outlaid the story, and it must have made an extreme impression because there's nothing else that's really followed it.
Yeah, I don't think there's been anything. I certainly like Mike Strong's books are good because they're on the German side and he knew Steiner very well and Buscott and that. So they're very good. They're very useful. They have pushed things forward. But yeah, I think you're right that apart from that, really, there hasn't. I mean, it will be difficult for anyone because obviously there's no veterans anymore. As I said, I've been collecting stuff since it came out, all sorts of little snippets again to big things like Hugh Pond. At the time, Hugh Pond wasn't involved with the reunion club and didn't want to be for a tragic reason. But years later, he did come out there and I spoke to him and I ended up going and interviewing him. So obviously Hugh's input into that will be brilliant. So that's one thing I will get on with later this year. And it'll be like coming home because they're my true love, really. The fantastic battalion, fantastic.
The battle at the chateau is worthy of an episode on its own, I think, Neil. And perhaps you do us the honour of coming back on the podcast and we'll dedicate an episode to the battle of the Chateau Saint-Gond. But for now, if you can just sort of take us back to the actual Merville Battery assault and where, again, we spoke when you came on before about Pegasus Bridge. In a similar vein, where's this operation to take out the guns at Merville coming from?
It's coming from intelligence, really. Once they decided it was going to be Sword Beach, in effect, where it was going to be one of those landing areas, then they start looking around at what the opposition's going to be, and they could see this battery being built. And although it was meant, from a German point of view, to defend the estuary, but of course it did have the capability of firing on Sword Beach. So then it does become a bit of a priority, yeah. I think that's where it's come from, really, its ability to be able to do that. Obviously, there were others as well, but they were going to be dealt with in other ways.
So why was it decided that it was going to be an airborne assault or a parachute battalion assault on the battery rather than just bombing or shelling from offshore?
They did try bombing it with very little success. But obviously they knew that there was no way they were going to, they had thought about it, hadn't they, but extending the beach to that side. But obviously they were worried about the guns from Le Havre causing chaos. So that was why an airborne landing behind it was decided upon.
And was it just luck of the draw that the 9th Battalion got that operation?
No, it was James Hill's decision. He knew his brigade very well, and he always described how each battalion had its own character. He called the 9th a very finicky battalion, and that he knew Terence Otway was an extremely good trainer of men. So that was why the 9th got the job. A great no stinker of a job, as he called it.
He wasn't the original CEO of the 9th, was he?
No, well, it depends how far you go back. The chap from the 10th Essex, when they converted Tommy Hearn, Piggy Hearn, they called him, very popular, but he was too old to jump. So he was replaced by James Hill. And of course, James was only there, I think, 2 or 3 months before he was promoted and given the brigade. And that's when Martin Lindsay came in as the commanding officer. Very famous man in the country, a polar explorer. He'd been on the Norwegian operation, seen what a mess it was, and quite controversially used his contacts through Parliament to influence things and get things done and complain about various people. But yeah, he turned up, and in 2 weeks after he arrived, Terence Otway came in as his number 2. But the plan, as we were chatting previously about the way the training develops, and the plan developed in the same way. They were attacking, in effect, mock-up before Christmas, Christmas 43. That shows you how far the plan goes back and how it developed all the way through early 1944, as it would. When you think, was it April? When April, Terence Otway took over, and that's not much time at all to form a plan. The main thing he did, really, it would seem, it was the introduction of the gliders and maybe a few detailed tank guns there or whatever. The trouble is, there's not that much detail to track how it changed, in effect. He does take a lot of criticism over the complication of the plan, but as James Hill said, the problem was Otway wanted to give his men as much chance of survival as possible. He was very hot on that. So then he's analysed everything, and that's what he believed was necessary, and James Hill backed him.
Certainly the success of an assault of this nature, regardless of whether it's taking a bridge or if it's against gun casement, a lot of it depends on the leadership of the CO, how he's doing things with his battalion. What kind of man is Terrence Otway, and what is he doing to ensure the success of this battalion?
Training. Full stop. He had been very influential in the training all the way through. He was a fiery Irishman. I haven't got to the bottom of why, particularly now, there seems to be this agenda against him. But he didn't court friendship. As he said, there was an interview on the television, a BBC programme for the anniversary in 94, where he said, I just wanted a fully trained, efficient battalion. And he didn't care if he wasn't popular. But you'll read some books as if the whole battalion hated him. Not true. Some of them didn't like him. Others did. Sid Knight loved him. But a lot of them, he was just a CO. He was sort of way above their heads. So this thing's been written about when he took over, the morale of the battalion sank. That is utter rot. He was a very driven man. He wanted a battalion, no question about that. He wanted a battalion. He had come out very high up in his Sandhurst training. He'd gone out to India and all this sort of thing and seen people who, because of their position or money, been promoted above him. So I don't see how that wouldn't affect anyone, especially if you've got the sort of drive and fire that he had. So he did upset people and he did upset the hierarchy, I think. But he was a very capable man, and he proved that at SANCOM. Anyone doubts him at SANCOM, his tactics and the way he led people at SANCOM was absolutely spot on.
And because you had mentioned the fact that he is so integral in their training, he's going to know what his battalion is capable of. And as we'll get to later, when he has to make a very important decision, that is based solely on his history of training, his understanding of who his men were, and that he knew them and knew certainly what they were capable of.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. He had to have confidence in the men, and he wanted to be able to trust them. There was some, I think 4 or 5 did some sort of misdemeanors, and they were cut from the D-Day plan. It was just, I can't trust you. So it was that kind of clear. You break that trust, then you're in the doghouse. But he was very proud of his men. I think he's one of these, he could never express it. Even at reunion dinners, I think it didn't really come across. But in the interviews I did with him, it's very apparent. When I first interviewed him, I was going to interview him. Obviously, I'd heard all the rumours about him and how terrifying he is or whatever. So I was a bit apprehensive, but he was fine. He was quite charming, in fact, very polite. He couldn't stand bad manners. Rightly so. But I always gauged him because I was almost, I can't believe I asked him when I look back. In The Big Drop, John Goddard's book, which is very good, he mentions, or he talks in there about when they're in the chateau at Ampreville and they're running low of ammunition and he was extremely tired. He said to me they were all so dog-tired, all the officers, before D-Day, that the postponement was almost a bonus to recharge the batteries a little. But after going through the battery and everything, and they're running out of ammunition, and again, he's completely thinking about the men. And he said to Paul Greenway, what do you reckon about surrendering? Which you think is quite a shocking thing, really. Because I wondered, he wanted a battalion, was it ego? Anyway, I said to him, is it true in John Golly's book about this incident where you said to Paul Greenway? By this time, Paul Greenway had passed away. So he could have easily said to me, no, that's a load of rubbish. He misunderstood me or whatever. Yeah. And he said to me, no, he said, that's absolutely true. I was very fatigued, depressed, probably a bit shocked, all that sort of thing after the battery. He said, but yeah, Paul slapped me back into shape. And I thought, well, it's not ego then, is it? I don't know how many COs would admit to that when they didn't have to. So yeah, a complicated man. It's the Marmite thing, isn't it? Ben Daniel couldn't stand him. Sid Knight loved him. It's personal opinion. But some of the things that are written about him recently are appalling, unjustified and appalling.
So when Otway takes over, what changes did he make to the battalion? How much involvement did his predecessor have with the plan for the battery? Or was it all just Otway's plan?
Martin Lindsay had a big part of the plan. Otway, he shifted a few officers about, I think. And of course, ultimately, in the end for the plan, Alan Parry was given charge of the RV party rather than his company, which didn't impress Alan Parry at all. I don't think Alan was a fan of his. But no, nothing really majorly comes to mind. Obviously, you got this recurring thing about giving the men the best chance by being as well trained as possible and having the dummy battery. And they worked that over and over again so that every man knew precisely what he was going to do, where he had to be.
That's with live ammunition, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, a lot of them were night time as well.
And that's at Walbury Hill in Berkshire.
Yes.
Talking about the plan, what was the plan for the battery assault?
The battalion would drop near Varraville, which is about a mile away. Well, start off first with, there was an RV party that were going first at the same time as the Pathfinders. The RV party they'd get all the rendezvous ready, and there was a reconnaissance party within 3 men that went towards the battery. They were to check out the lie of the ground, various other things, and brief Colonel Otway when the battalion reached them outside the battery. The initial plan was to blow 4 gaps in the wire, get there, get to the wire, then wait for the 3 gliders to come in. There'll be flares signalling to light up the battery for them to land. A Company, 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, would be on their left to cover their approach march and also while they were attacking the battery. The C Company was the actual assault company, which was going to go in and take the casemates. And they had 591 Parachute Squadron engineers with them with these general wave charges. And there was also some in the gliders to go in and actually blow the barrels of the guns. And then once they'd done that, it was out onto the next few jobs. One of the things that people forget, it was never their intention to occupy the battery. It was in, blow the guns, get out.
So they get to delay. D-Day is not going to happen for 24 hours. What's the mood knowing that they're going to have to wait?
Well, disappointment, really, because they're so keyed up to go. They've been trained to the very edge. They were on the edge, and to have a delay, they just want to get on with it after all that. So it was disappointment. Luckily, only for them 24 hours.
So it's the early hours now of the 6th. They're now flying as part of the second wave of Tonga.
Yes, yeah, in effect, it's the main drop. You've got the first wave of the Pathfinders. And
what starts going wrong? Because they're dropping up around Varraville, aren't they? Drop Zone V. What's going on? The plan is starting to sort of unravel a little bit from the offset just because they can't land in the right place.
Well, there was several reasons. First of all, the 2 sticks of the 22nd Independent Parachute Company that had been dropped to mark the DZ had been scattered, not too far, but into that flooded area where the Germans had flooded the area to the east, obviously to prevent an airborne landing. And it took them quite a while to get out of it. In fact, 1 stick didn't really make it in time. Apparently, one Eureka got working at some stage, and there was some Hall of Fame lights for the equipment gliders as well. But it must have been very close, or even when some of the aircraft were perhaps on top of them. So that was one problem. The direction finding equipment wasn't in place perhaps quick enough. What didn't help was, of course, Varraville is literally 2 minutes flying from the coast. So there was very little time for the pilots to orientate themselves as such, because there'd been a bombing raid on the Merville Battery, huge bombing raid, and there was a dust cloud resulted from it. And so, because they had to fly through, because these were coming in the Coburg area, the flak had increased enormously. So you got all these factors adding to it. So yeah, a lot of the 9th Battalion were scattered all over to the east in the flooded area. And they weren't the only ones. The Canadians, again, were on the same DZ, and the same thing happened to the Canadians. So it wasn't exactly an ideal start to the operation.
You see it in the longest day, don't you? The guys up to their necks in water and all the rest of it. There weren't quite as many drowned as first thought. It's come out sort of in recent years. I know Otway himself said that he saw guys drown under the weight of their equipment in these flooded areas. Do we know roughly how many did actually perish in those waters, or were the majority of them taken prisoner?
Well, the figure was for a long time 192 missing. But when files from Q were opened and the sort of evader reports and the investigations into those that were missing, you can work out from, and the POW list, of course, that I think there's still a discrepancy. The problem is the nominal roll for 9th Battalion on D-Day is missing. So we've got no exact parameter to start with. Even taking the adjutant, Hal Hudson, left a letter with a number in it about a week before D-Day. So it wasn't going to be too many more, if any. But I've got a discrepancy in my calculations, I think, for about 40. It's not 192, no. I'm sure with the war graves, obviously, they corroborated their figures with all sorts of other records. So there must be an explanation for them. It's just we haven't managed to, me and 1 or 2 others who look into these things. Hopefully we'll be able, because of course, again, the problem is the Chateau Saint-Côme as well, because you've got a figure there on a certain day as well. It's just constantly fluctuating figure, and it's very difficult to make things tally. Things don't add up currently when it comes to numbers, and I think 40 is the problem figure at the moment for me. With the flooded area, it varied. The fields, you could walk about from deep to chest high, depending on the contour of the field. But the real problem was the irrigation ditches. They were a nightmare for them, absolute nightmare.
Give our listeners the sense of square mileage on how these guys are scattered.
The furthest aircraft was a Canadian one, actually. They were dropped east of Le Havre. And you think, how the hell did that? But 9th Battalion, you're looking perhaps up to 20 miles away to the east. When you read the RAF reports, they made a map showing you where all the sticks were. No, I don't think they were.
No.
They guaranteed they were very highly trained pilots in that group. So,
which is going to play a role, as we'd mentioned, a very important decision that Otway has to make, because when they get to the rendezvous point, he's not going to have what he thinks he should.
No, well, he was in an absolutely, as you might expect, an absolute foul mood on the DZ when he found out what had happened. In fact, there was an incident where in Jefferson, there were some French people about, and Jefferson said to him, "What shall I do with them?" He said, "Shoot them. What are they doing out this time of night?" And they obviously weren't resistance. I don't know if they'd come out, see what was going on or what, but obviously it was a German curfew anyway. And he didn't want any leaks, in effect, him telling Germans that they were there and whatever. But Jefferson thankfully put them in a shed, told them if they come out, we'll shoot them. So he was in a bad mood. He had very good officers behind him that were backing him. Parry was very good. He also had Sid Knight, who was the end sergeant, Sid Knight, who was literally a right-hand man for him. He trusted him implicitly. Well, there were some good leaders, even though they were so young in the battalion.
So how many men has Otway got now? They've rendezvoused. I know he allows a little bit of extra time to gather the troops, but when all is said and done, how many guys has he got?
When they actually left, he had about 150 out of nearly 600 there should have been. And of course, you think of his mind, when he said to his batman, didn't he, "What am I going to do?" He said, "You ain't got any choice. You go on."
I've never been in that position. I can't imagine being in that position. You're tasked with something, but yet you don't have your full battalion with you. You don't have the tools that you need to accomplish it. And yet he still makes this decision, "I'm going to go," knowing this and knowing that this could be a disaster. And for somebody who is very concerned about the welfare of his men, to still go with that is an extraordinary decision to make.
Yeah, when you think you've been through all that planning, you've done all that meticulous training where every man knows what he's got to do, and then suddenly you've got a hodgepodge, in effect, of 150 men. It's interesting, actually. Dan Hartigan, the Canadian, wrote an excellent book. He was dropped quite near off the DZ, but became disorientated. Somehow he got mixed up with the night, and he was taken to Otway and another character, and sort of as if to say, "Oh, we've got two more." And he said, "Well, what the bloody hell am I going to do with those two?" And of course, the Canadians thought, "Well, we're as good as you are." And then Dan Hartigan realised afterwards it was because Otway was thinking they don't know anything about the plan or what they should be, all this sort of thing. And you can understand that, can't you? That sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, you're right, 150. He knew then that it was just going to be sheer blood and guts and bravery. And you're right, yeah, do or die. Hindsight is always a powerful thing, isn't it? And because we know now it was successful. When you just don't know, how do you attack a fortified battery with minefields, barbed wire, machine guns, and you've got 150 men, and they're in emplacements and goodness knows what else, defended trenches? The odds are not particularly good. So, yeah, and the bravery of those men.
What's he looking at in terms of heavy equipment?
Really hasn't got any heavy equipment and Vickers machine gun, if you can count that. There was nothing, no mortars to light up the battery or fire. Obviously, some of the men would have had 2-inch mortars. No, everything, because the equipment gliders, of course, didn't arrive either. They all got spread all over the place. So there was obviously no jeeps, no anti-tank guns that were there to back them up if the casemate doors were shut.
He has got some lengths of Bangalore torpedoes, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Bangalores. Yeah, did have some Bangalores. Yeah.
So he makes his decision. He sets off from the drop zone, and then he meets up with Major Smith at the rendezvous. What changes is he now having to make to his plan, obviously, with a massively reduced force? What's he come up with?
It was very hard to break apart, kind of thing, that way that plan came about. Certainly Major Parry had a big part in it. I think to say that with the amount of Bangalores, that's limited to 2 breaks in the wire anyway, plus the gaps in the minefield, because they had no mine detectors. They literally scraped with their hands and knees through the minefield towards the wire and created these paths. Parry was the one who actually went round, and it was because there were so few officers saying, "Right, you, we're going to form a group. You're going to do this case, mate. You're going to do that one." Barney Ross was one. Obviously Jefferson and Dowling. Harold Long. In fact, it was really, really frustrating. I was due to interview Harold Long, and I spoke to him a little bit on the phone, and I started to ask him questions. He said, "Oh, when you come up, we'll have a chat." And then a few days later, he passed away. Really upsetting.
So you've got the 4 casemates. What was the order, and how many were in the assault groups for each casemate?
It's difficult because I didn't get to speak to Harold Long. Obviously, Mike Dowling was killed. So you're only looking, you take the one that went for casemate 1, Jefferson's, there was only about 12 to 15 of them with C Company. So Barney's would have been roughly the same. Obviously, people went in after him. The A company, extra A company men went through and this sort of thing. But it was minimal in those groups.
And what was the opposition at the battery? What did the Germans have?
They had the garrison that was stationed with about 150 men. How many rats are in the battery at the time? Just don't know how many were in there.
Because the actual commander of the garrison, Steiner, he's not actually at the battery when the assault takes place, is he? He's up.
No, he's down on the coast in the observation post.
Yeah.
And that was one thing. Steiner was, if you read Mike Strong's book, he obviously wasn't a Nazi in the slightest, but he was a very committed soldier. He was a very correct type of officer. And he'd only been in charge of the battery about a week after the commanding officer had been killed in a bombing raid. And he said certain things, like he tried to get back to the battery, but there was fighting going on in Merville. Well, I don't know who that could have been. I know people were spread wide, but she's talking about this massive battle. And that the way it rings is, it feels like the battle from the next day when 45 Royal Marine Commando went in. It feels like that. So I don't know if he was getting mixed up.
Talking of which, one of the other conundrums about Merville, where's this mystery glider come from? We're not talking about the two that actually made it to the battery of the three. There's this mystery glider. What's all that about?
Well, they reckon their first alert, the first thought they've been attacked when this glider landed close to the battery. And they said it was vicious fighting and this sort of thing, and then it burnt out and whatever, and all the occupants were killed. But where this came about really initially, obviously with Jefferson's book, but Mike Strong, who'd been involved, as I mentioned in a previous episode, in the Merville Battery for a long time, he knew the Germans very well. And he went round interviewing them. He was very friendly with Steiner, Buscott, all these people, Peter Tim. And they're the ones who told him about this first alert. And for years, I disagreed with Mike. He said that the glider landed inside the battery. And that's how they described it. It just didn't fit because there was only one glider. Every glider was accounted for, apart from this one. And in it, that they get away, the pilots get out. Now, how the hell, if you're inside the battery, do you get out? You can't. Plus, when you look at aerial photographs, there's just nothing. But anyway, after a few years, this Mike actually said he'd gone back through his evidence, and this glider was actually outside the battery, which of course makes absolute sense. It's far more possible. And I think it's been pinned down, but again, they couldn't really call it an assault as such because there was hardly anyone in it. It wasn't a troop glider, it was a transport glider.
I've heard it said that it was a Canadian glider with engineers.
I think you're right. I think there was a few Canadians on it, yeah.
The assault is happening. How much of a factor is this notion of this esprit de corps of these guys that have been bonded through their training, through their parachute training? How much of that is playing a role in their ability to achieve darn near the impossible?
I think it was absolutely crucial. Yeah, they were very proud to be members of the Parachute Regiment. The 1st Airborne Division had done very well in North Africa, and they'd earned that label, the Red Devils, and they wanted to live up to that tradition, just sheer bloody mindedness. When you chat to them in later years, they said they didn't see themselves as an elite, but I'm sure they did. The training they were doing obviously was far more than normal training. And as well, just jumping out of an aircraft, that takes something special to jump out of an aircraft, I think.
Well, especially since this is new, this is a concept that has just started.
Yeah.
And the doctrine is kind of being formulated as things proceed. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. They're a very, very young regiment and needed a chance to prove themselves.
So do the guns get knocked out? I've heard, no, they weren't. Yes, they were.
Well, certainly two of them were. No question, two of them were. Georgie Hawkins, who was wounded and left in number 4 casemate, he actually didn't remember any gun. He was there for about 3 or 4 days when they'd left, and he didn't remember the guns opening fire at all. But 4 or 5 Commando, whose job it was to silence the battery if the 9th didn't manage it later in the afternoon. Some of those got there, and I spoke to, interviewed some of them. They got to the perimeter wire and it was silent, and suddenly one of the guns opened fire, and they said this gun was sort of firing about 1, possibly 2 rounds a minute sort of thing. So it wasn't, they didn't thought it's not worth attacking. So sporadic. This was about 5 o'clock on D-Day, something like that. So again, people make a big thing that guns weren't. We know why, because obviously the Paras didn't have the right explosives. Perhaps there were other things they could have done, being wise after the event. But ultimately, what they did was a success because Merville Battery didn't open fire on Sword Beach on D-Day. It's a big thing as well. Some people make a thing about, it wasn't captured until August and it was a bit of a thorn in its side. But after D-Day, it's almost an irrelevance. You've got artillery from all sorts of areas pounding beaches that are far more high caliber or fire rate and this sort of thing. the damage had been done as far as the Germans are concerned. The British 3rd Division were getting ashore, and there was no way they could have caused problems. I'm not sure the odd shell did. I think they did sink 1 or 2 ships, didn't they, out to sea? They used to get such a response if they did open fire that it made it reluctant to do so. And I also checked some files. We had such fantastic command of the air. We had reconnaissance aircraft literally going around that area. And if there were any problems, they were calling in airstrikes. So they can say, I didn't capture it till August, but it was sitting there firing the odd round, and its real danger had gone. It was an irrelevance.
As you say, I think it fired a few shoots actually at Weestrom, didn't it? And I think you're right, it did sink a supply ship.
Yeah.
So they've taken the battery, they've put the guns out of commission, however temporarily. How many men has Otway got left standing?
Well, it actually came out with 75. Again, this is another thing I can't add up. The injured, the captured, the killed. But when they met at the cavalry, obviously you had Hugh Pond's glider, the men from his glider arrived. So it took it up to about 100 that he had at the cavalry.
2 gliders of the 3 that were intended did actually turn up. What was the problem there?
Well, the problem was they couldn't, it's pitch dark and the night had nothing to illuminate the battery with. There was supposed to be a Eureka set up as well, which apparently was, but obviously the gliders didn't pick up on it. Well, actually, one might have. I think I read a report not so long ago saying one of them might have caught the sick. But Hugh Pond's glider landed, amazing piece of luck really, to the east of the battery in the lane towards Gonnerville, because there was a German patrol came up that lane just after they got out of the glider. And goodness knows what chaos they would have caused if going in behind the night. And the other one, you'll read it, it's sort of 4 miles away or whatever, but that wasn't too far either. It was just sort of northeast of Gonnerville, really, where it landed. A little bit of a flooded field. And of course, they got after the battalion that departed.
So they reorged the cavalry, which is just up the road from the battery. And Otway's shattered, isn't he? There's plenty of reports of him just sitting there looking like he's been knocked for 6 with his head in his hands and everything. He's shattered at this moment, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of them told me it was almost like a flu. Your head was sort of bunged up and you were almost in a dreamlike state, I guess. And the shock of it all, of everyone, the losses, actually going through it, the realisation that perhaps you survived it. And it was, ironically, it was Parry who came along with his wooden cart, got his whiskey out in his hand flask. So top old battle, what typical lighten the mood,
Yeah.
But it took them a little while to recover, get their senses together and head off.
And what happened to the wounded?
There's a farm literally 100 yards down the road called the Harrasterets, and about 22 of them were taken in there, and they stayed there until, the evening when the Padre, John Gwinnett, got word that they were there. He commandeered a truck with 1 or 2 others and did several journeys to get them back through what really was no man's land, from the Mental Crossroads, that is.
Weren't a couple of guys actually left in the casemates?
Yeah, it's like Georgie Hawkins was. He was the only one I can remember being left. He was in casemate 4. It was odd because, say, about the Germans reoccupying the battery, and some of them just stayed behind and hid in the command post. He never seems to have had any treatment as such. So we say the commandos found him when they went in the next day and spoke to him. It's a strange one, that. In fact, years later, because they thought he was dead, on one of the pilgrimages, someone said to Len Daniels, "Have you got a friend of yours you haven't seen for a while?" They took him over to George Hawkins, took one look at him and said, "You're dead."
And this is not a case of once they've successfully taken the guns out of commission, okay, yay, we're great. They're not being relieved anytime soon, are they? They're still technically behind enemy lines.
No, well, their next job was to knock out one of the radar casemates on the way back towards Salinel's on the road there. But he decided they certainly didn't have the men to do that then. So they went to their main objective, which was to get to Airborne land, which they did, of course, and ended up losing a few people there.
I think the Chateau at Ambreville and the Chateau Saint-Côme, I think that's worthy of an episode all on its own to do it justice.
Neil, you're not going to get off easy just with only 2 episodes.
No, it's been fantastic as ever. And thanks ever so much for coming back to the podcast. So anyway, gents, it's time, gentlemen, please. Thanks to all our listeners for tuning in, and you'll hear us on the next one. Cheers.
Cheers.
And ham and jam.
Ham and jam.
Ham and jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
Thank you for calling me a number 2.